Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's topic is autism and the privilege of diagnosis. There is a very good reason why it's called that, not just because it sounds like a cool Harry Potter novel, although it does, I won't deny that. But the reason I'm talking about that today is because I am in the process of getting a formal autism diagnosis. I believe I have mentioned a few times that I'm on the spectrum, but I don't yet have a formal diagnosis. Um, and I've suspected that I'm on the spectrum, and I've suspected it for many, many years. And looking back on my life, I'm really kind of surprised that I was never, to my knowledge, was never formally evaluated for it. If I was, it would show up in my records somewhere, and there is no record of ever having been evaluated. I have my reasons for why, or I suspect that there are reasons why, and I have suspicions about what those reasons may be. Won't get into that here because that's not what we're talking about. But I just kind of wanted to explain that within the autism community, there can often be a divide of sorts between those who are diagnosed and those who are either not diagnosed or self-diagnosed. I would consider myself a mix of self-diagnosed and not diagnosed. Because what I mean is self-diagnosed and not formally diagnosed. But that's why I'm seeking a diagnosis, because one of the reasons is because there are services out there that would be very beneficial to me if I had the appropriate diagnosis, because you can't access services without a diagnosis, because insurance won't pay for them. Now, I understand that that doesn't mean that, I get an autism diagnosis and then all the services are available to me just because I have that. I understand that that's not the case, but it would make that process easier with an appropriate diagnosis. It's also about, I'd be being dishonest if I didn't say that there's some sense of peace that would come from hearing, yes, you have autism, because I have struggled and fought for so long and fought so hard to figure things out for myself and to find a name, and they've given me several things that they think it is, but none of those have fit, like the way that an autism diagnosis has, like the criteria and all of that. But one of the issues with getting a diagnosis is that, okay, let me start over. So those who have a formal diagnosis don't realize that it is a privilege to be able to have that diagnosis. I'm not saying that it's that it's never difficult for them. I'm saying that because they had the means to acquire an appropriate assessment, whether it was as a child or in adulthood, because they had that opportunity, they now have answers. I don't have those same answers in the same capacity, and so there's privilege there. They also don't have to sit and argue every single time something comes up that's related to them being autistic, and they don't have, that proof. They don't have to sit there and argue with someone about whether or not they're on the spectrum, and they don't have to sit there and fight for treatment that they need. And I've had to do that for far too long, and it's rather frustrating and disconcerting. And so hopefully this will alleviate that to some extent. I imagine there will always be battles to be fought, but I'm really sick of this being one of them. And there are many barriers to getting a diagnosis, which is why so many people who are autistic don't have a diagnosis. And I touched on one of them already, being, access to services, which has both obviously a monetary component, but also there's a social component to access to services. Um, Minorities tend to have access, less physical access to services, and also um, social stigma might keep a minority away from seeking an appropriate diagnosis. Either if you're a parent of a child who has autism, you might, there might be a social stigma there if you're a minority. I mean, related culturally, I know that, and I've always kind of gotten the sense in the African American community that there is an extra stigma around um, anything related to mental health and or disability. I've sort of gotten that vibe quite a bit, and it makes sense. There are legitimate reasons why that is. I can't get into those today because, again, that's not what this video is about, but perhaps I will do a separate video on that. And then there's just, if you lack an understanding of how autism manifests, then you're a lot less likely to see it in your child, especially if it's not, a severe form of autism. If your child has a milder form, or if you as an adult have a milder form of autism, and you don't understand the symptoms, you're a lot less likely to think that you have it, and you're a lot less likely to seek out treatment even if you did have access to it. The other aspect of it, of a barrier, is that the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is the manual that's used to diagnose all manner of disabilities, disorders, mental illnesses, and all of that stuff, that manual itself is biased against minorities. And I don't just mean racial minorities. I mean, if you're a person with a disability, there's a disadvantage for you there. If you're female, depending on the diagnosis in question, there's a disadvantage there. That is especially true with autism. Females with autism present their symptoms quite differently than males do a lot of times, and so that can be overlooked. The reason I think that there is a bias is because the DSM was written by mostly written by white guys, white males, and so that's the lens through which diagnoses are seen. So, if you are a minority in any sense and you happen to present differently than what that book says, instead of being, culturally aware and culturally competent, and thinking about the differences, the discrepancies between how a person presents and what that manual says, a lot of clinicians will be like, well, you don't fit the criteria for these reasons, therefore you don't. It doesn't warrant a diagnosis. And that can be, I think, very devastating, is to, not only are you having your experience denied, right there on the spot, but the very tool that is used to deny that experience is just, it's rigged. And again, I don't say that with malice or cynicism. That is the case. It's rigged, and so that can make achieving diagnosis very difficult. And so, okay, so all of those things make this process difficult, and those are all things that I need to consider going into this. But I do want to touch on, because you guys might be wondering, maybe, I don't know. So how do I support somebody who's, going through something like this, where they're trying to find answers, and, it's obvious this is very important to them? What I would say is, one, if somebody's telling you their experience, don't invalidate their experience by either saying, oh, it's okay, labels aren't important. Because if they're telling you that they're going through this, obviously it is to them. So, you telling them that labels aren't important is, that's denying that for them, and that's not supportive. And the other thing you can do is to recognize that, especially if you're a person with autism and you're supporting someone else with autism who's trying to get a diagnosis. If you happen to have been one of the people who were fortunate enough to obtain your diagnosis as a child, or you were fortunate enough to have the means to obtain it as an adult, be aware that you have privilege that the other person doesn't have. And that doesn't mean that you have to feel bad about the fact that you were fortunate enough. It just means that you need to be aware that your experience was different than theirs, but it doesn't make it any less valid. It doesn't make it any less real. So those are the two things, and that you could say to someone, and to help them, let them know that that you hear them, that that it's difficult and that it's important to them to get this diagnosis. Also, let them know that no matter what it's, so they get the diagnosis, and whether the diagnosis says yes, they're autistic, or no, they're not autistic. Let them know that that doesn't change the fact that they're struggling, and that you're still going to be there. You're still going to validate who they are, regardless. That's something that two of my friends in these last couple of days, as I've been freaking out about this, have done really well for me, has been to validate that experience. And so I want to take a moment to just say thank you, Steph, and thank you, Leah, for being there and for having my back and validating my experience and listening to me freak out a little bit. It means more to me than I could say that I have folks like you in my life, especially right now. So yeah. So to recap, I guess, if the things that I want you to take away from today are, be aware of your own privilege, not so that you can feel bad about it, but so that you can understand that your perspective on life isn't necessarily like someone else's, and that because of circumstances that are out of another person's control, they don't have the same privileges that you do. Be aware of that. Everybody has some kind of privilege. It's just that some people have a lot less privilege than others, and so it's important to be aware of that. And I say this a lot in my videos, but just continue to validate each other's experiences, and to continue to understand each other's experiences, because that's really, that's the only way we can get along together in this world, is to continue to strive to understand one another. Also, last point, lack of a diagnosis does not invalidate someone's experience, so keep that in mind. And I guess that is all for today. Thank you all. I hope I didn't ramble too much. I tend to do that. Please feel free to ask questions and post comments and other such things. And I will see you all next time. Peace.